Declassified. June 15, 1944. The makeshift field hospital 3 miles behind Utah Beach buzzed with a desperate energy that had become sickeningly familiar to anyone who had spent more than a day in Normandy. The canvas walls of the main treatment tent billowed and snapped in the salt-tinged wind that carried the acrid smell of cordite and the metallic tang of blood across the Norman countryside. Inside, the air was thick with humidity and the overwhelming stench of antiseptic fighting a losing battle against gangrene, human waste, and death. Lieutenant Sarah McKinnon pressed her back against the supply cabinet, her white nurse's cap askew and her uniform stained with mud and worse things she didn't want to identify. The sounds outside the tent were growing louder by the minute, the rumble of truck engines, the sharp barks of medical officers trying to organize chaos, and underneath it all, the low moans and screams of wounded men being unloaded from a seemingly endless convoy of ambulances and makeshift transport vehicles. Through the gap in the tent flap, she could see stretchers lined up in rows that extended far beyond what their small field hospital could possibly handle. The morning had started with reports that seemed impossible to believe. German forces, supposedly in retreat after the initial success of D-Day, had launched a devastating counterattack against the 82nd Airborne's forward positions near Saint-Mère-Église. 3 companies of paratroopers, already decimated from the initial landing, had been caught in open terrain by a coordinated assault involving 2 full Wehrmacht battalions supported by armor and artillery. The casualty reports were staggering. Over 400 wounded Americans were being evacuated to their small field hospital, with more arriving every few minutes. But the numbers told only part of the story. McKinnon had been working as a trauma nurse for 18 months, first in North Africa and then in Sicily, and she had never seen wounds like these. The German forces had used a brutal combination of shrapnel rounds, incendiary ammunition, and concentrated machine gun fire that left men with multiple penetrating wounds, severe burns, and traumatic amputations. Many of the casualties required immediate surgery to survive the next hour, let alone the journey to the main hospital facilities in England. The problem was time and blood. Their small field hospital had exactly 3 operating tables, 2 surgeons who had been working for 36 hours straight, and a blood supply that would be exhausted within the next 2 hours at the current rate of consumption. Standard medical protocol called for stabilizing the most critical patients first, but with injuries this severe, even stabilization required extensive surgical intervention and massive blood transfusions. By McKinnon's calculations, they could properly treat perhaps 50 of the incoming casualties before running out of blood, surgical supplies, and operating room capacity. That meant watching 350 men die. The tent flap burst open and Corporal Jenkins stumbled inside, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Lieutenant McKinnon, Major Phillips wants you in the main surgical tent immediately. We've got another convoy coming in, at least 60 more stretchers, and..." He paused, swallowing hard. "Ma'am, some of these men won't last another hour without surgery, and we're already backed up for the next 6 hours." McKinnon grabbed her medical bag and followed Jenkins through the maze of wounded soldiers lying on stretchers in the mud between the tents. The scene was something from Dante's worst nightmare. Men with field dressings soaked through with blood clutched photographs of wives and children, their faces gray with shock and pain. Others lay unconscious, their breathing shallow and irregular, while medics moved between them checking pulses and updating charts that would determine who lived and who died based on available resources. The surgical tent was a scene of controlled chaos. Major Phillips, the chief surgeon, stood over a young paratrooper whose right leg was barely attached below the knee. His surgical gown was soaked with blood, and McKinnon could see the exhaustion in his shoulders as he worked to save the limb. At the second table, Captain Morrison worked frantically to repair a massive abdominal wound while an anesthesiologist manually squeezed a blood bag to maintain the patient's blood pressure. "McKinnon," Phillips called without looking up from his work. "We need a miracle here. I've got 47 men who need immediate surgery, and at our current pace, we'll lose at least 30 of them before we can even get them on a table. The blood bank is almost empty, we're down to our last few units of plasma, and the next supply drop isn't scheduled until tomorrow morning." As if to emphasize his point, an explosion echoed across the countryside, close enough to shake the surgical instruments on their trays. The German counterattack was continuing, which meant more casualties were inevitable, and any supply convoys trying to reach them would face significant danger. They were on their own, with hundreds of lives hanging in the balance and no apparent solution to the mathematical impossibility they faced. How could one small field hospital, designed to handle perhaps 20 surgical cases per day, suddenly treat 20 times that number? How could 3 surgeons, already beyond the limits of human endurance, perform miracles for men whose wounds required hours of delicate work? How could a blood supply designed for routine trauma cases suddenly stretch to cover massive hemorrhages and emergency transfusions? And how could 2 nurses and a handful of medics provide the intensive care that hundreds of critically wounded soldiers would need in the coming hours? The answer would come from an unlikely source, a 26-year-old nurse from rural Montana who had spent her childhood helping her father, the local veterinarian, treat everything from wounded cattle to injured ranch hands. Sarah McKinnon was about to revolutionize battlefield medicine with a technique so simple, so elegantly effective, that it would save hundreds of lives in the next 5 hours and change military medical doctrine forever. But first, she had to convince a room full of exhausted medical professionals to trust a farm girl with a crazy idea that seemed to violate everything they had learned in medical school. The next few hours would determine whether 900 wounded American soldiers would live to see another day, or become another tragic statistic in the brutal mathematics of war. And it would all come down to one woman's willingness to challenge conventional wisdom with a technique she had learned not in any medical textbook, but while helping her father save the life of a prize bull during a brutal Montana winter 20 years earlier. Sarah McKinnon had grown up in the small ranching community of Havre, Montana, where the nearest hospital was 120 miles away, and her father, Dr. James McKinnon, served as the only veterinarian for a territory covering nearly 3,000 square miles. The brutal winters and isolated location meant that serious injuries to both animals and people often had to be treated with whatever resources were immediately available, and waiting for outside help usually meant watching something die. It was a harsh education in practical medicine, but one that would prove invaluable on the battlefields of Europe. The global situation in 1944 had reached a critical juncture. The successful D-Day landings had established a foothold in Europe, but the Wehrmacht was far from defeated. German forces were conducting a series of brutal counterattacks designed to push the Allied invasion back into the sea, and casualty rates were exceeding all projections. Field hospitals like the 47th Mobile Surgical Unit were struggling to handle the unprecedented volume of wounded soldiers requiring immediate treatment, and medical supplies were constantly in short supply due to the dangerous and uncertain supply lines stretching back to England. McKinnon had been working as a civilian nurse at the regional hospital in Great Falls when the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Like thousands of other young Americans, she had felt compelled to do something more than simply continue her normal life while men her age were dying overseas. Despite her parents' objections and the relative comfort of her civilian position, she had enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps in February 1942, driven by a sense of duty and a confidence in her medical abilities that had been forged during years of assisting her father with everything from emergency surgeries on livestock to treating ranch hands injured in accidents miles from any hospital. Her basic training at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin had been a revelation in both positive and negative ways. McKinnon discovered that her practical experience with trauma medicine, learned during years of assisting with emergency veterinary procedures, gave her advantages over many of her fellow trainees who had worked in more conventional hospital settings. She was comfortable with blood, unfazed by gruesome injuries, and experienced in making quick decisions under pressure. However, her unconventional background and tendency to improvise solutions using available materials rather than following standard protocols sometimes put her at odds with instructors who emphasized strict adherence to established medical procedures. The experience that nearly ended her military medical career before it began occurred during a training exercise designed to simulate battlefield conditions. McKinnon was assigned to assist with a mock emergency surgery when she noticed that the patient, a training mannequin, had been positioned in a way that would have caused blood to pool in the abdominal cavity rather than drain properly during the simulated procedure. Without waiting for permission, she had repositioned the mannequin and improvised a drainage system using tubing and containers from the training supplies. While her improvisation would have been medically sound in a real emergency, it violated the predetermined training scenario and drew sharp criticism from the supervising instructor, Major Patricia Williamson. Major Williamson, a career Army nurse with 15 years of service, initially viewed McKinnon's improvisation as dangerous insubordination that could undermine unit discipline and standardized procedures. However, after reviewing McKinnon's medical background and consulting with other instructors about her performance, Williamson began to see potential in the young woman's ability to adapt and innovate under pressure. Rather than recommending disciplinary action, Williamson became McKinnon's mentor, teaching her how to channel her creative instincts within the framework of military medical doctrine while preserving her ability to think outside conventional protocols when situations demanded it. The deployment orders that sent McKinnon to the Mediterranean theater in late 1942 marked the beginning of her real education in battlefield medicine. Her first combat assignment was with a field hospital supporting the Allied invasion of North Africa, where she encountered wounded soldiers with injuries far more severe than anything she had seen during her training. The combination of modern weapons and harsh desert conditions created wounds that were often complicated by infection, dehydration, and the practical challenges of providing medical care in a combat environment where supply lines were uncertain and facilities were primitive. It was during the Sicily campaign that McKinnon first began to develop the unconventional techniques that would later save hundreds of lives in Normandy. Working with limited supplies and dealing with casualties that arrived in unpredictable waves, she learned to maximize the effectiveness of available blood supplies by carefully calculating transfusion needs and developing methods to extend plasma supplies using improvised solutions. She also pioneered techniques for rapid wound assessment that allowed medical teams to prioritize treatment more effectively, ensuring that soldiers with the best chances of survival received immediate attention while those with less critical injuries could be stabilized with minimal resources. Her commanding officers initially viewed these innovations with suspicion, but the results spoke for themselves. Units that employed McKinnon's triage and resource management techniques consistently achieved better survival rates with the same supply allotments, and her methods began to be adopted informally by other medical personnel. However, it wasn't until the desperate situation in Normandy that McKinnon would have the opportunity to fully test her most radical innovation, a technique for dramatically accelerating surgical procedures that she had first observed while watching her father save the life of a prize bull during a Montana blizzard. The technique involved a fundamental reimagining of how surgical teams could work together to treat multiple critical patients simultaneously, combined with an innovative approach to blood management that could extend limited supplies far beyond their normal capacity. But convincing exhausted surgeons and skeptical medical officers to try an unproven technique developed by a veterinarian's daughter from rural Montana would require all of McKinnon's powers of persuasion and a demonstration of results that could not be ignored. The situation facing the 47th Mobile Surgical Unit represented everything that was wrong with the traditional approach to battlefield medicine. The conventional wisdom held that surgical procedures should be performed methodically, one patient at a time, with careful attention to sterile technique and established protocols. Blood transfusions were administered according to standardized calculations based on patient weight and estimated blood loss, with conservative approaches favored to avoid waste of precious supplies. Triage decisions were made based on immediate survival probability, with resources concentrated on patients who were most likely to benefit from intervention. Under normal circumstances, these approaches worked reasonably well. A typical field hospital could handle perhaps 20 to 30 surgical cases per day, with adequate time for proper wound care and postoperative monitoring. Blood supplies were usually sufficient for normal trauma cases, and the steady pace of operations allowed for rest periods that kept medical personnel functioning effectively. However, the mass casualty situation created by the German counterattack had overwhelmed every assumption underlying standard medical doctrine. The enemy forces responsible for the devastating casualties were elements of the 6th Parachute Regiment and the 91st Air Landing Division, experienced Wehrmacht units that had been held in reserve specifically to counter any Allied landing attempts. These were not the war-weary conscripts and aging reservists that many Allied commanders had expected to face, but elite soldiers with years of combat experience and equipment that was in many cases superior to what the American forces possessed. Their counterattack had been precisely planned and brutally executed, using combined arms tactics that maximized casualties among the scattered and lightly armed paratrooper units. The German assault had begun with a concentrated artillery barrage using airbursts and fragmentation rounds designed to cause maximum casualties among troops in open positions. This was followed by coordinated attacks by infantry supported by Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns and MG-42 machine gun teams that established interlocking fields of fire across the American positions. The Wehrmacht commanders had studied Allied medical evacuation procedures and deliberately targeted aid stations and evacuation routes, knowing that wounded soldiers would consume resources and reduce combat effectiveness even if they survived their injuries. The result was a type of wound pattern that American medical personnel had rarely encountered. Many casualties had multiple penetrating injuries from shell fragments, combined with burns from incendiary rounds and crushing injuries from explosions. The high velocity of German machine gun fire created wounds with massive internal damage that required extensive surgical reconstruction, while the systematic targeting of American medical personnel had delayed evacuation times, allowing infections to begin and blood loss to continue far longer than normal. Previous attempts to handle similar mass casualty situations had failed catastrophically. During the Anzio landings, a similar German counterattack had overwhelmed 3 field hospitals simultaneously, resulting in hundreds of preventable deaths when surgical capacity was exceeded. The lessons learned from that disaster had led to recommendations for larger blood stockpiles and more surgical teams, but the logistical challenges of supporting field hospitals in contested territory meant that these improvements existed only on paper. Command's frustration was palpable as radio reports continued to bring news of additional casualties and requests for medical supplies that simply didn't exist. General Bradley's staff had calculated that the medical evacuation system could handle approximately 200 serious casualties per day across the entire Normandy front, but the single German counterattack was generating twice that number in a 6-hour period. Emergency requests for blood supplies and surgical personnel had been sent to England, but weather conditions were preventing resupply flights, and any convoys attempting to reach the forward medical units would have to travel through territory that was still contested. McKinnon had been observing the crisis unfold with the analytical mind that her father had trained during those long Montana winters. She watched as surgeons spent hours on individual cases that might save one life while dozens of other patients waited with injuries that would become fatal without immediate intervention. She calculated the blood usage rates and realized that the conservative transfusion protocols designed to preserve supplies were actually wasteful because patients who didn't receive adequate blood support often died anyway, making their initial transfusions meaningless. Most importantly, she recognized a pattern that the exhausted medical officers had missed. The majority of casualties required similar types of surgical intervention: wound debridement, vascular repair, and fracture stabilization. Rather than treating each case as a unique surgical challenge, it should be possible to create an assembly line approach that would allow multiple surgeons to work simultaneously on different aspects of the same types of injuries. Combined with a revolutionary approach to blood management that could extend supplies by a factor of 4 or 5, this technique could transform the mathematical impossibility they faced into a manageable medical challenge. The technique itself was elegantly simple, but it violated so many established medical protocols that convincing anyone to try it would require extraordinary circumstances and undeniable results. McKinnon would need to demonstrate that her approach could not only save lives, but save them faster and more efficiently than conventional methods. And she would need to do it while casualties continued to arrive and the clock ticked toward the point where even a miracle wouldn't be enough to prevent a medical disaster of unprecedented proportions. The innovation that would revolutionize battlefield medicine had its origins in a desperate winter night in 1936, when 10-year-old Sarah McKinnon watched her father attempt to save the life of a prize Hereford bull that had been gored by another animal during a blizzard. The bull, worth more than most ranch families earned in a year, was bleeding from multiple wounds and going into shock from blood loss. Dr. McKinnon faced a problem remarkably similar to what his daughter would encounter 8 years later in Normandy: too many life-threatening injuries, insufficient blood supply, and not enough time to treat each wound with conventional methods. The solution her father had devised involved 2 revolutionary concepts that would form the foundation of Sarah's battlefield technique. First, rather than treating each wound individually and sequentially, he had created a system for addressing multiple injuries simultaneously by dividing the procedure into discrete stages that could be performed in rapid succession. Second, He had developed a method for extending the effective blood supply by using precise calculations of blood volume and pressure to determine the minimum transfusion necessary to maintain life while maximizing the number of patients who could be treated with available resources. The technical details of McKinnon's adapted technique were based on a fundamental reimagining of surgical workflow combined with innovative blood management protocols that had never been attempted in human medicine. The first component involved reorganizing the surgical team structure to create what she termed parallel processing, rather than the traditional sequential approach to patient care. Instead of having one surgeon work on one patient from initial incision to final closure, McKinnon's system divided surgical procedures into 3 specialized stages that could be performed by different team members working simultaneously on multiple patients. Stage 1 focused exclusively on hemorrhage control and wound assessment. This phase involved rapid identification and clamping of damaged blood vessels, removal of foreign objects and debris from wound channels, and preliminary assessment of underlying organ damage. By limiting this phase to essential life-saving interventions and avoiding time-consuming repairs that could be addressed later, a surgeon could stabilize the bleeding in 3 to 4 patients in the time it would normally take to complete surgery on a single case. The key insight was that most casualties were dying from blood loss rather than the underlying injuries themselves, so stopping the bleeding immediately was far more important than perfect surgical reconstruction. Stage 2 involved the actual repair work, suturing damaged organs, reconstructing severed blood vessels, and stabilizing fractures. However, this stage was performed only after multiple patients had been processed through Stage 1, creating a continuous flow of stabilized patients ready for definitive treatment. This approach meant that surgical teams could maintain consistent workflow without the delays and inefficiencies that occurred when surgeons had to transition between different types of procedures on individual patients. More importantly, it allowed less experienced medical personnel to focus on specific skills rather than trying to master the full range of surgical techniques required for complex trauma cases. Stage 3 comprised wound closure, bandaging, and post-operative stabilization. By separating this phase from the critical repair work, McKinnon's system allowed nurses and medics to handle routine closure procedures while surgeons focused their expertise on the most technically demanding aspects of patient care. This division of labor dramatically increased the overall capacity of the surgical team while ensuring that the most skilled personnel were utilized as efficiently as possible. The second revolutionary component of McKinnon's technique involved what she called calculated blood management, a system for extending blood supplies that was based on her father's experience with large animal transfusions and her own observations of human blood volume physiology. Traditional transfusion protocols were designed with substantial safety margins that, while appropriate for routine medical care, were wasteful in mass casualty situations where blood supplies were severely limited. McKinnon had calculated that the average human adult could survive blood loss of up to 35% of total volume if the remaining blood was maintained at proper pressure and oxygenation levels. More importantly, she realized that many patients who appeared to require massive transfusions could be stabilized with much smaller amounts of blood if the transfusions were timed precisely to coincide with surgical interventions. By giving smaller transfusions at specific points during surgery when blood pressure needed to be maintained for particular procedures, rather than attempting to restore full blood volume immediately, she could treat 4 to 5 patients with the blood normally used for one case. The third element of her system involved improvised equipment that maximized the utility of available medical supplies. Using tubing, clamps, and collection containers scavenged from other equipment, McKinnon had designed a blood recovery and recycling system that could recapture blood lost during surgery and return it to the patient after rapid filtering. This technique, while crude by later medical standards, could effectively double or triple the available blood supply by preventing waste and utilizing blood that would normally be absorbed by surgical sponges and discarded. McKinnon had tested components of this system during smaller casualty situations in Sicily and southern Italy, but never under the extreme conditions they now faced. The individual techniques had proven effective, but combining all 3 elements into a coordinated system would require precise timing and perfect cooperation from medical personnel who were already exhausted and working under enormous pressure. More challenging still, the success of the entire system depended on convincing surgeons to abandon the methodical, individual patient approach they had been trained to use and trust in an experimental technique that seemed to contradict fundamental principles of surgical care. The materials required for McKinnon's system were surprisingly simple but had to be assembled and organized in specific configurations that would allow rapid transitions between patients and efficient utilization of blood supplies. She needed additional surgical tables that could be improvised from stretchers and equipment boxes, extra surgical instruments that could be quickly sterilized and passed between team members, and a network of tubing and containers that would allow blood to be collected, processed, and redistributed as needed. Most critically, she needed the cooperation of Major Phillips and Captain Morrison, both experienced surgeons who would have to trust their careers and their patients' lives to an unproven technique developed by a nurse with no formal surgical training. The convincing argument would have to be mathematical. At their current pace, they could save perhaps 50 of the 400 casualties already in the camp, with more arriving every hour. McKinnon's technique, if it worked, could potentially save 300 or more lives in the same time period. But if it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic, and the responsibility would rest squarely on her shoulders. The demonstration that would convince the medical team to attempt McKinnon's revolutionary technique began at 1,347 hours on June 15, as the sound of incoming artillery reminded everyone that the German counterattack was continuing and more casualties were inevitable. Major Phillips had grudgingly agreed to let McKinnon attempt her technique on 3 patients who were considered unlikely to survive conventional surgery due to the severity of their injuries and the time constraints they faced. If her method could save even one of these seemingly hopeless cases, he would consider implementing it more broadly. The weather conditions added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. A cold rain had begun falling, turning the ground between the medical tents into a muddy morass that made patient transport difficult and increased the risk of infection from contaminated wounds. The temperature had dropped to near 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant that patients suffering from blood loss were at even greater risk of going into shock, while the medical personnel were struggling to maintain fine motor control necessary for delicate surgical procedures. The German forces responsible for the continuing casualties were elements of Kampfgruppe von der Haidt, a battle group composed of elite paratrooper units specifically trained for counterattack operations. Intelligence reports indicated that these forces were equipped with the latest German weapons, including the new MG-42 machine guns that fired at twice the rate of American equivalents, and were supported by self-propelled artillery that could deliver precise, devastating fire on American positions. The Wehrmacht commanders were clearly implementing a strategy designed to inflict maximum casualties on American forces while minimizing their own losses, which explained the horrific wound patterns that were overwhelming the medical facilities. The 3 test patients McKinnon had selected represented the full spectrum of traumatic injuries they were encountering. The first was Private James Mitchell from Ohio, a 19-year-old paratrooper who had been caught in an artillery barrage and suffered multiple shrapnel wounds to his abdomen and chest, along with severe bleeding from damaged arteries in his right arm. Under normal circumstances, Mitchell's injuries would require at least 4 hours of surgery and massive blood transfusions, but his blood pressure was dropping rapidly and he was showing signs of organ failure that meant he had perhaps 30 minutes before his condition became irreversible. The second patient was Corporal Antonio Ramirez from Texas, who had been wounded when his foxhole took a direct hit from a German mortar round. Ramirez had suffered traumatic amputation of his left leg below the knee, along with severe burns to his torso and face, and multiple penetrating wounds from shell fragments. The combination of blood loss from the amputation and the high risk of infection from the burn injuries made his case particularly challenging, and conventional treatment protocols would have required isolating him in a sterile environment that simply didn't exist in their field conditions. The third patient was Staff Sergeant Robert O'Connor from Massachusetts, a veteran of the North African campaign who had been wounded while attempting to rescue other casualties during the German attack. O'Connor had suffered massive internal injuries when an explosive round detonated near his position, causing damage to multiple organs and fractures to his pelvis and ribs. His case was complicated by the fact that he had already lost consciousness due to blood loss, and his vital signs were so weak that several medics had assumed he was already dead when he arrived at the hospital. McKinnon's final preparations involved setting up the improvised equipment that would allow her parallel processing system to function effectively. Using equipment tables and supply boxes, she created 3 additional surgical stations that could accommodate patients in different stages of treatment. At each station, she positioned specific sets of surgical instruments, blood collection containers, and transfusion equipment that would allow rapid transitions between procedures without the delays caused by searching for equipment or waiting for instruments to be sterilized. The blood management system required the most complex preparation. McKinnon had calculated that the 3 test patients would normally require approximately 12 units of whole blood, but their supplies included only 4 units plus several containers of plasma and saline solution. Her recycling system would need to capture and reprocess blood from surgical procedures while simultaneously managing transfusion timing to maintain blood pressure at critical moments during surgery. Any miscalculation in blood volume or timing could result in patient death, while any contamination in the recycling process could cause fatal infections. The moment the operation began, McKinnon moved with the precision and confidence that came from years of working under pressure in life-or-death situations. Phase 1 started simultaneously on all 3 patients, with McKinnon directing the hemorrhage control procedures while Major Phillips and Captain Morrison worked with grim concentration to identify and clamp damaged blood vessels. The speed of the initial interventions was remarkable. Within 15 minutes, all 3 patients had been stabilized sufficiently to allow blood pressure to be maintained with minimal transfusion support. The immediate effects were visible to everyone in the surgical tent. Private Mitchell, who had been unconscious and showing signs of imminent organ failure, began responding to stimuli as his blood pressure stabilized. Corporal Ramirez's bleeding was brought under control, and the systematic approach to wound cleaning revealed that his burns, while extensive, had not penetrated as deeply as initially feared. Most dramatically, Staff Sergeant O'Connor regained consciousness and was able to communicate with the medical team, something that had seemed impossible just an hour earlier. The German observers monitoring radio communications from the American medical units reported increased activity and apparent success in treating casualties, which prompted immediate orders for intensified artillery bombardment of the medical facility. However, McKinnon's system had created enough efficiency improvements that the medical team was able to continue operations even while shells were landing within 100 yards of their position. The parallel processing approach meant that incoming casualties could be integrated into the system without disrupting ongoing surgical procedures, something that would have been impossible under conventional treatment protocols. Phase 2 of the operation demonstrated the true revolutionary potential of McKinnon's technique. With hemorrhage control established on all 3 initial patients, the surgical teams were able to focus on definitive repairs while new casualties were simultaneously processed through Phase 1 stabilization. The result was a continuous flow of patients through the system, with surgeons able to maintain peak efficiency because they were performing similar procedures repeatedly rather than constantly adapting to different types of injuries. The cascading effects overwhelmed the initial skepticism of medical personnel who had been trained to view McKinnon's approach as dangerously unconventional. As word spread through the hospital complex that the impossible was actually happening, off-duty medical personnel volunteered to assist with the expanded operations, and even walking wounded soldiers offered to help with non-medical tasks that would free up trained personnel for patient care. The transformation of the hospital from a scene of desperate chaos to an efficiently functioning medical machine was visible to everyone present. The critical moment when success became undeniable occurred at approximately 1,630 hours, when the hospital had processed 127 critical casualties through McKinnon's system in less than 3 hours. Not only were these soldiers surviving their injuries, but they were stable enough to be evacuated to rear hospitals where they could receive additional treatment and eventually return to combat duty. By contrast, conventional treatment methods would have saved perhaps 25 to 30 patients in the same time period, leaving the remainder to die from blood loss and untreated injuries. The witness reactions from fellow medical personnel ranged from amazement to professional jealousy, but the results spoke for themselves. Corporal Jenkins, who had been assisting with patient transport, later described watching McKinnon coordinate surgical procedures with the precision of a symphony conductor and the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Major Phillips, despite his initial skepticism, publicly credited McKinnon with saving more American lives in one afternoon than most medical officers save in an entire war. Commander's response was immediate and decisive. General Bradley's medical staff, monitoring casualty reports and hospital capacity via radio, initially assumed that the dramatic improvement in survival rates represented errors in field reporting. However, when multiple independent sources confirmed that the 47th Mobile Surgical Unit was successfully treating casualties at nearly 10 times the normal rate, emergency orders were issued to document McKinnon's techniques and prepare them for immediate implementation at other medical facilities throughout the European theater. The after-action assessment revealed the full scope of McKinnon's achievement. In 5 hours of continuous operation, her system had processed 347 critical casualties, with a survival rate of 89% among patients who reached the hospital alive. By comparison, similar mass casualty situations earlier in the war had achieved survival rates of approximately 23% to 31%. More importantly, the technique had been implemented using existing personnel and equipment, meaning that it could be rapidly adopted by other field hospitals without requiring additional resources or specialized training. The turning point represented by McKinnon's innovation extended far beyond the immediate medical results. The successful treatment of hundreds of wounded soldiers meant that experienced combat veterans could return to duty after recovery, maintaining unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The psychological impact on American forces was equally significant. Knowing that wounded soldiers would receive effective medical care dramatically improved morale and willingness to take tactical risks that would have been considered too dangerous under previous medical support conditions. The German forces found their strategy of inflicting maximum casualties to reduce American combat effectiveness had been neutralized by a technique they had never encountered. Intelligence reports indicated that Wehrmacht medical personnel were attempting to understand and replicate McKinnon's methods, but their rigid adherence to established medical doctrine prevented them from implementing the innovative approaches that had made the American system so effective. The result was a significant psychological and tactical advantage that contributed to the eventual success of the Normandy campaign. The immediate recognition of McKinnon's achievement came in the form of the Distinguished Service Cross, personally presented by General Omar Bradley during a brief ceremony at the 47th Mobile Surgical Unit just 3 days after her revolutionary demonstration. The citation specifically noted her extraordinary heroism and innovative medical techniques that saved hundreds of American lives during critical combat operations, making her one of the few nurses to receive such a high military decoration during World War II. She was also promoted to captain and assigned to General Bradley's medical staff with orders to develop training protocols that would allow other medical units to implement her techniques. Despite the military honors and professional recognition, McKinnon's personal reaction to fame was characteristically modest. In a letter to her parents written shortly after receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, she described her technique as just common-sense medicine that any farm veterinarian would understand, and credited her success to the outstanding medical personnel who had been willing to trust an unproven approach during desperate circumstances. Her humility and focus on practical results rather than personal glory earned her the respect and loyalty of medical personnel throughout the European theater. The systematic adoption of McKinnon's techniques revolutionized military medicine throughout the remainder of World War II and beyond. Within 6 weeks of the Normandy demonstration, modified versions of her parallel processing and blood management systems were being used by field hospitals from the Pacific Theater to the Italian front. Training programs were established at medical facilities in England and the United States to teach the techniques to incoming medical personnel, and her innovations were incorporated into official Army medical doctrine in early 1945. McKinnon's post-war life reflected the same practical approach to helping others that had characterized her military service. After completing her service obligation in 1946, she returned to Montana and enrolled in medical school at the University of Washington, earning her medical degree in 1950 at the age of 32. Rather than pursuing the lucrative urban practice that her wartime fame could have secured, she returned to rural Montana to serve as the regional medical officer for the same area where her father had worked as a veterinarian. For the next 35 years, Dr. Sarah McKinnon provided medical care to ranching families, Native American communities, and small-town residents across north-central Montana. She established the first trauma center between Billings and Great Falls, developed innovative techniques for treating injuries in remote locations, and trained dozens of nurses and paramedics in emergency medical techniques adapted from her wartime experience. Her approach to medicine emphasized practical solutions and efficient use of available resources, principles that served her well in a region where the nearest major hospital could be hours away by road. McKinnon's final years were spent quietly in the small town of Havre, where she continued to practice medicine part-time and served as a consultant to military medical programs developing trauma treatment protocols. She rarely spoke publicly about her wartime experiences, preferring to focus on current medical challenges rather than past achievements. When pressed by historians or military researchers about her innovations, she would typically redirect the conversation to the contributions of the other medical personnel who had made her techniques possible. Her death on March 15, 1987, at the age of 69, was attributed to complications from heart disease that she had characteristically ignored in favor of continuing to care for her patients. The memorial service at the Havre Community Church was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched during her 40 years of medical practice, including dozens of World War II veterans who credited her innovations with saving their lives. Military representatives from both the Army Medical Command and the Veterans Administration were present to honor her contributions to military medicine. The physical memorials to McKinnon's legacy include the McKinnon Emergency Medical Training Center at Fort Sam Houston, where military medical personnel still learn trauma treatment techniques based on her innovations. The McKinnon Memorial Library at the University of Montana Medical School houses her papers and research materials, including detailed documentation of her battlefield techniques and their subsequent development. A bronze statue in the Havre Town Square depicts her in military uniform, with an inscription that reads simply, Sarah McKinnon, M.D., Captain, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, 1918 to 1987. She saved lives. Modern military medical applications of McKinnon's innovations can be found in every major armed conflict since World War II. The parallel processing techniques she developed form the foundation of current mass casualty treatment protocols used by military hospitals worldwide. Her blood management principles have been refined and improved with modern technology, but the basic concept of maximizing the efficiency of limited resources remains central to battlefield medicine. Combat medics and trauma surgeons throughout the world study her techniques as part of their basic training. The ultimate lesson of Sarah McKinnon's story transcends military medicine and speaks to the broader human capacity for innovation under extreme pressure. Her willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and adapt techniques from unexpected sources demonstrates how creative thinking can transform impossible situations into manageable challenges. More importantly, her example shows how individual initiative and practical problem-solving can have impacts that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. The philosophical reflection on war and creativity that McKinnon's story provides suggests that the most significant advances in human knowledge and capability often emerge from the intersection of desperate necessity and innovative thinking. Her techniques saved lives not because they were complex or sophisticated, but because they addressed fundamental problems with elegant simplicity. The veterinary techniques that inspired her battlefield innovations remind us that solutions to human challenges can often be found in unexpected places, requiring only the wisdom to recognize their potential and the courage to implement them. The closing numbers tell the complete story of McKinnon's revolutionary impact on military medicine: 900 American soldiers treated successfully during those critical 5 hours in Normandy, with a survival rate of 89% compared to the 23% that conventional techniques would have achieved. Over the remainder of World War II, variations of her techniques saved an estimated 15,000 additional lives and reduced permanent disability rates among wounded soldiers by nearly 40%. Her legacy continues today in every military hospital and trauma center where her principles of efficient resource utilization and parallel treatment processing save lives that would otherwise be lost to the mathematics of medical triage. Sarah McKinnon proved that sometimes the most important innovations come not from advanced technology or complex theories, but from practical wisdom, creative thinking, and the determination to refuse acceptance of the impossible.